What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I'm Jordan, joined with Jared, and today we have a special guest. Chrissy Hansen is joining us. She is a researcher, and she calls herself a Bible hobbyist to distinguish herself from other Bible people more globally, but she does have a collection of peer-reviewed research that you should definitely check out if you're interested in the topic. So, Chrissy, for people who aren't familiar with your work, why don't you introduce yourself real briefly?
Hi. So I am a trans woman and a Bible hobbyist. I describe a Bible hobbyist as someone who knows what they're talking about, like just enough to be dangerous. I got into biblical research kind of just independently. It's a long story. It mostly just involves me having dated a pastor's daughter, and the pastor happened to have a PhD in Old Testament from the University of Chicago and gave me a few free lessons on Hebrew and Greek. And from there, I just got into it on my own, and now I'm here. I have about 25, close to 30 peer-reviewed publications in the field, as well as a number of journal review articles. And I'm also about to submit the final draft of my upcoming book on the authenticity of Philemon.
Mm-hmm. So. That's exciting. So
and
basically,
often under talked about book of the Bible.
Yes. And particularly its authenticity, which I'm arguing against.
So basically, you got into this by trying to impress your significant other's dad. Is that how it worked?
Essentially, yeah. And then I got really into it. I thought of making it a career for a little bit. That didn't end up panning out. I'm now a graduate student at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. I'm getting my master's degree in English right now. I got my bachelor's in English as well, specializing in creative writing.
Awesome. Well, we're not going to be talking about English today, except as it interfaces with Greek, though. So today, what we're going to be talking about is Paul and his letter, primarily to the Galatians, but also in the Corinthians, where he mentions that he met the brothers of the Lord. And this is a point of contention in discourse on YouTube and some other places, but mostly YouTube, where the phrase is important because there's a group of people, primarily atheists, who contend that Jesus never existed. Mythicists such as Godless Engineer or Richard Carrier argue that Jesus as a person didn't exist in history. He was a spiritual being from start to finish. And so any references to him as a physical being have to be figurative in some way. And specifically to this one, Paul, the mainstream scholarship is that Paul meets Jesus' physical brothers. However, if Jesus has physical brothers, then he existed. Ergo, he couldn't have met Jesus' physical brothers. That's how the argument goes. So what we're going to be doing is with Chrissy. Chrissy is going to be walking us through what the actual verses say in the original Greek, because contrary to what you may have heard in Sunday school, the Bible was not written in English in the King James Version. My
pastor told me if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. So.
That's right.
Specifically only the King James.
So. Right, exactly. So we're going to be diving into what Paul likely meant when he referred to these people and how we can know that. So that's your background. If you want to open your Bibles to follow along, the two verses that are most important for this discussion are Galatians 1:19 and 1 Corinthians 9:5. But before we dive into that, now that we have the background, I thought we'd first start just kind of zooming out a little bit from just Paul and just speaking more broadly in history, because this wanting to know what somebody who wrote something thousands of years ago, this isn't a problem unique to trying to figure out Paul, right? This is something historians do all the time. So if a historian isn't sure or wants to argue about what a person meant when they said XYZ, how do they figure that out? What do they do?
So there are multiple ways that you can do this. One of the ways, and one of the more common ways, is to try and look at the etymology of the word and figure out what the etymology of the word is. And that can give you a sense of like how it might be broadly used or at least originally utilized. And so perhaps that's one of the meanings that we could apply to a particular passage and the way that word is used. Another way is to see if that person uses that word or phrase elsewhere in their own work, and if the meaning is more clear in those passages, then we can cross-compare and essentially be like, okay, so he uses it this way in this passage, so maybe this is the way that he uses it here as well. And we're going to actually get to this because mythicists use this kind of a internal cross-comparison. Another way, and a very useful way, is also to compare how a scribe uses this word in comparison to their other writers in their same context. So if we wanted to know how Paul uses like the word brother, we could also compare him to other Greco-Roman, Jewish, and early Christian writers and get a sense of that as well. These are among the more common ways that you can do this, and the most effective ways of doing this, especially when you can compare entire phrases and the way that they're used in a broad context, and you can also make rough delineations about what the author's educational background. So, for example, Paul is writing in fairly fluent Greek. He's writing very competently. He knows how to go and find scripture verses. So he also knows how to read and parse Greek. And this is important because ancient writing and reading were not the same skills. These are, if you have both of these skills, it's very likely that you are from a bit of a higher elite or more elite class in society. You have you have obtained a lot of clear education, which is expensive, very expensive. And Paul very clearly has this. He can go through the Greek Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and he can find and parse the Greek. This is important because Greek is, in this time, is only written in a blockchain form. All the words just pile together. And ancient writers had to know how to parse all of that out. There are no word divisions in ancient Greek. So if you look at an ancient Greek scroll or fragments like the P52, the fragment of the Gospel of John, everything rolls together. And that's just how they wrote back then. And you have to know how to parse Greek. And this is why these skills could develop separately. Some scribes were only trained to copy the letters, and they may not have even known how to actually read the letters they were copying all of the time. Sometimes they are more competent than they actually do know how to read, and they make alterations, and that's where we get omissions and interpolations and other kinds of changes like that. And then those who are really skilled are going to know how to parse through text and even copy from them. So intertextuality, which is what we see in the epistles with Paul.
I think that's really important to keep in mind. I think people sometimes get a sense of like the past is just like the present. Like when I learned to read and write, like it's hard to even fathom what it would look like to know how to write but not read. You know, it's so ubiquitous now.
Yeah.
And also, I think this came up in our conversation with Kip, the fact that how rare literacy was in the ancient world.
Yes.
And you had to have, they didn't have like a public school everyone went to. You had to be able to afford the leisure time. In addition to just like being able to afford to pay someone to educate you, also had to be able to afford to not be working the fields or whatever, you know? So basically like all the writings we have are from like all the rich assholes who had plenty of time and money to do it.
Yes. Yes. And then on rare occasions, we get like papyri letters. We have actually a fairly substantial collection of like little papyri letters. And most of these are probably actually written by hired secretaries. Most of these people probably couldn't read or write. It's even the case that probably a majority of even elite class people could not read or write. In fact, we even have occasions where Roman emperors could not read or write. This was not uncommon at all. And this continued even into the Middle Ages. We have kings and other rulers that couldn't do this either.
They don't have time to read and write. They got orgies to attend, you know?
I mean, especially if you're Caligula, like reading and writing is boring.
Yeah, ain't nobody got time for that.
No.
All right. So why don't we work from the outside in, and we'll look outside of Paul first and look at how other people writing in a similar context use the words. Because, as you pointed out, this person, when they're using language in a context, and words only work as words if everyone else kind of understands what you mean when you use them, right? When other people use this kind of phrase, well, first of all, what is the specific phrase we're talking about?
So the phrase we're talking about, I want to briefly talk about how the mythicists argue, just for a sec.
Sure.
So the mythicists are going to try and argue that the word ἀδελφός, brother, is used by Paul in a very vague sense, and he broadly and most commonly uses it in this fraternal sense. We are all brothers in Christ. He does not use it in a biological sense very often. And so they point to that as one of their keys, because and it is honestly a good point to note that if he is using the word brother, ἀδελφός, in that way, it could on the surface impact the way we read this passage. I want to make it clear that just like prima facie, this is not inherently a bad argument that they make. The problem comes that this is ἀδελφός here is not standing alone, but is part of a genitive construction. So it is not ἀδελφός, but in, for example, Galatians 1:19, we are talking about ton ἀδελφον tau kurio. I butchered that Greek, by the way.
You don't need to
much better than I did.
So we'll pass that by. I see you in the comments. I see you, Kip. Anyways, we're going to pass that by. But essentially, this is a genitive phrase, and what it means is the brother of the Lord, or the Lord's brother, or if you are a godless engineer, the brother of me.
Okay, that's an interesting.
He did that on Twitter. It was really, really funny.
So in English, just if everyone wants to turn to their Bible, the verse here in Galatians is, "Then after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him for 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother." And so what you're pointing out is, while Paul uses the word brother all throughout his writings in this kind of figurative sense, here he's not just saying brother, he's saying the Lord's brother, and the fact that it's combined with another word in a phrase is important.
Yes, because that construction appears specifically in a lot of Greco-Roman, Jewish, and early Christian texts. And it has a very specific meaning in every single case. I have found no exceptions, but it always means a biological sibling. I have found no exceptions to this. I went through not too long ago, and using the Loeb Classical Library and a few other online databases, I looked up this exact phrase and found about close to 30 instances of it across the ancient world. And in every single case, it means the brother of somebody, without exception. I found 3 instances of this in the works of Plutarch, one in Plato. I found it also in Marcellinus's Life of Thucydides. In there are 4 or 5 occasions of it in Diodorus Siculus. Also, Alexander of Aphrodisias, Aelius Herodianus. Just the list goes on and on and on.
And every single time they're talking about someone's physical, biological brother. Now, that begs the question, are there other people who use the word also in this other sense that Paul uses it? Do writers sometimes describe people as like brothers more figuratively?
They do use the single word brother more figuratively. That is particularly common in texts like in Epictetus's discourses or in Seneca's letters. And these are Stoic works. Stoic philosophy was probably actually familiar to Paul. He has a lot of similarities with it, and a lot of scholars have argued for some close overlap. It's actually been argued pretty convincingly since the 1800s that this was the case. However, they do not use that full genitive construction in any other sense than a biological sibling. And that is what becomes extremely influential. I went further and I also looked up the specific form of it in 1 Corinthians 9:5, where we have oi adelphoi to chorio. And that phrase, I actually could not find the three letters or three words, oi adelphoi to. I could not find that in almost any other writer except for in the works of Origen. And in Origen, he uses it in that sense as brothers of someone in the biological way. And he also cites the Septuagint, 2 Samuel 6:3-4, which also contains the two words oi adelphoi, and also carries that exact same meaning.
And just so everybody can understand what we're talking about, that specific phrase, I'll read it here for you, but it's referring to Paul is asking the question, do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? He's asking a question. So he's kind of lumped in three different groups in there.
Yes. So
that's really interesting that even Origen, who would have been familiar with Paul's writings, uses this phrase in the biological sense.
Yes. And that points us to the point that it most certainly refers to biological siblings. And we'll get back to Origen on this specifically and a few other church fathers, because while they all use this phrase to denote biological siblings, later ones are going to actually try and deny this plain meaning of the text, very similar to the way that mythicists do, actually.
Right, because there was a problem with virginity, so we can't have Jesus' brothers, but they wouldn't need to have that whole rigmarole if it
didn't mean what it said it.
Right.
If it didn't mean what it did on the plain surface of it, if it didn't mean that, they wouldn't have to make the arguments. They wouldn't exist.
Would you want to?
So, essentially, around the 3rd century, there is an argument that starts forming. Origen is part of this, on whether or not Mary was a perpetual virgin, i.e., did she retain her virginity after the birth of Jesus? Early authors don't seem to think this. Tertullian very clearly ascribes to Mary having other sons after Jesus. The Irenaeus seems to hint at this as well. But once you start getting into around the time of Origen and then afterwards, they start having some disconcerted feelings about this, specifically because of the veneration of Mary and her virginity. I think probably one reason for this is going to be that if they allowed Mary to lose her virginity afterward, it opens up maybe she was not a virgin before, and that starts becoming a potential problem. Also, it just has to do with the veneration of Mary as being the chosen one by God. God would not have chosen someone that was not going to be pure. And in early Christian writings, this aversion towards unnecessary sexual activity is also a thing that exists. It goes all the way back to Paul's writings, where he says in 1 Corinthians, if you do not if you can stay celibate, do so. only people who absolutely need to should get married and have sex.
Just remember, kids, sex is bad, and people who have it are bad. Just remember that.
Yes.
So this is interesting because the church fathers, for those who may not know, Origen among them are influential writers in early Christian history. And at this point, they're still reading and speaking Greek. Right. Yes. So it's not like this was a second language. Well, they may have been second language. This is the language that they were working in. So it was a language they were very familiar with.
Most of them. Tertullian is actually working in Latin.
Okay, fair enough. But for the people who are working in Greek, they're much closer to the source and they would have been intimately familiar with the language. And when they're making this argument, it seems like if there was this obvious avenue where it's like, oh, well, obviously he's just talking about them being figurative brothers, like all this other thing. It seems like that would be the much easier off-ramp if that would make sense to a native speaker.
Yeah, exactly. If I want to argue that Mary was a perpetual virgin, she never lost her virginity, and that the brothers of the Lord does not indicate physical brothers. If there was an option for that to mean anything other than a biological relative of Jesus, I would have made that argument. I would have brought up, no, this is just a fictive fraternal kinship, the way that mythicists do. But they don't. Not a single one of them does. They all universally think that either these are actual brothers, these are cousins, or these are half-brothers by Joseph through a different woman.
But always with a biological component.
Always with a biological component. There's no way around that, because that is the plain meaning of the text. And they have to try and find some way to retain this loose semblance of what the text means that also fits their theological agenda. If the alternative, that there was a cultic title, the Brothers of the Lord, that just generally applied to baptized Christians, they would have said so, and they would have argued that was the case, and there would have been no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
And I think this deserves emphasis, because one of the struggles that we as modern people have when we're reading texts from thousands of years ago is we're not native speakers. Anyone who was a native speaker is long dead. And so we're trying our best to infer meaning and like trying to understand the context, but we don't live in that context. Whereas the people who are writing at the time do live in the context. They have all that knowledge already. And so, like you said, if it would be obvious to anyone, it would be obvious to them, you would think.
Yeah. Yes. It's interesting. This is the first I've heard of this line of reasoning, this argument. And Origen was a prolific writer amongst the other early church fathers, and they were very familiar with the texts. And so you're right. I find that fascinating.
Yes. And not only that, but there are even some indications that they were aware of biblical texts that we don't even have anymore. So, for example, if I remember correctly, it's Clement of Alexandria who cites a passage out of a supposed Pauline letter to the Macedonians, which is completely gone. They were aware far more than we are. So they have an even better chance of knowing that this was a cultic title. And there's no evidence of that among any of the early church fathers. There are a few other things to note about this passage just from the Greco-Roman context as well, and also wider Christian texts. So, for example, another argument is that it's really strange that Paul is referring here to the brother of the Lord and not the brother of Jesus or Christ. This is an interesting argument, but when you look at the way this phrase is, this genitive construct phrase is used outside of Paul's letters, it's very obvious it could just be applied to anyone, including just like titles. So, for example, Socrates, Scholasticus, in his ecclesiastical history, speaks of the brother of the king. This is a phrase that's actually used frequently in other writings as well. And you also have like contracell somewhere in that origin talks of the brother of the person bound, an unnamed person. You just can ascribe brotherhood to titles as well.
And since first names were often the only names we had back then, it would make sense that you would want to use something more specific, like a title, to specify that person that you're speaking of.
Yeah, because there's almost certainly other Christians around that were named Joshua. That was an exceptionally common name in the ancient Palestinian world, and then also within the Jewish diaspora beyond. So, yeah, Jesus would not be exactly the most helpful name to necessarily mention there. And then also, Paul just frequently interchanges Lord and Jesus and Christ throughout his letters. So it would be very obvious to any readers of Galatians who he was referring to.
That touches on something that I've heard some mythicists, Godless Engineer in particular, argue that this particular argument has always seemed bizarre to me, that they say, well, if he had meant Jesus' physical brothers, then he would have said the brothers of Jesus, not the brothers of the Lord. And I'm like, but for Paul, the Lord is Jesus. They're the same person. Like,
right.
Like, what do you mean? Like,
yeah, no, exactly. And then it just doesn't work with the way that we see other ancient writers using this phrase. So they will just say the brother or brothers of the king.
Just like I might say the brother or the son of the president. I don't need to say Donald. You all know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I say the president's son, I know that they're talking about the only son that President Biden currently has.
Right.
If someone says, the brother of the king, well, that might be vague, but the thing is that you're probably going to know who that is because context. Like in the works of Socrates Scholasticus, there is a context that makes it clear who this king being talked about is. Right. In Galatians, it is very clear that the Lord is Jesus. He doesn't need to add extra steps here, and he doesn't need to make any other clarifying note, because there is only one person who is Kurio. That is Jesus. Again, it's just a universal conclusion that this phrase always denotes a biological kinship, and the on the face obvious meaning is that it always denotes physical brothers of somebody. And the only people who have argued against this historically are people who are driving a theological agenda surrounding the virginity of Mary, because this on the face does not work with their conclusions. So the obvious and plainest reading of this is that this is a brother of Jesus, just from comparison to outside texts.
It's interesting that there's the parallel between the theologically motivated arguments of early Christianity and the atheology motivated arguments of some mythicists. That's an interesting parallel. But you touched a few times on the way that Paul talks about this elsewhere. So we've talked about the context. We've talked about the broader Greco-Roman usage of the word. So now let's go within, because this is where mythicists like to live. They look at all of Paul's writings and the places where he talks about brothers, and Paul frequently refers to other Christians as his brother, their brother, our brother. And so, like you mentioned before, the argument goes, Paul uses brother like this, all this other places. So that's what he means here. Now, why does that argument not work for you?
Yeah, as I was noting before, the fundamental reason why this does not end up working for me is just straight up due to the fact that this is not the same kind of a use of the word brother. It is this iteration of brother is absolutely dependent on the genitive that comes right after. Without it, so this is a good way to know if brother is meant to stand alone. If I were to remove the end of this, like the referent of brother, would it make sense as an identifier? So if I was to only write James the brother, or brother James, Would this stand as a reasonable identifier? No. It does not tell me who James is.
Right. And I think this is a point that is often glossed over because, as Jared mentioned, and as you mentioned, people didn't have last names, and there were names that were common all throughout the group. And so if the mythicist argument works, if James is just some rando Christian, right, and the Lord's brother just means the Christian, then the verse in Galatians becomes, "But I did not see any other apostle except James the Christian." Well, which Christian, Paul? Like, which James do you mean? You haven't told me anything.
Right. And this becomes an even bigger problem for mythicists, because mythicists like Godless Engineer, John wants to argue that this James in Galatians 1:19 is different from the James in chapter 2. How is he So if I were to remove that referent, the Lord, that specific identifier, would this actually meaningfully identify him as a different person? No. Another reason this doesn't work is also taking the entire phrase in total. If this was a cultic title, as Dr. Carrier argues, just referring to, a general Christians or baptized Christians or a specific group under the apostles, it becomes exceptionally confusing, because all of the apostles would also be brothers of the Lord. So it also still does not meaningfully clarify any difference between James in chapter 1 and James in chapter 2.
And Carrier argues in his book that in order for that kind of usage to work, there'd have to be this concerted effort to police the language and like some kind of authority holding it. But that's not how languages work. If you just imagine in a conversation, if I was trying to talk to you about this James that I knew, and I was like, and if he's right, I would say, "Hey, James, the Lord's brother." Which James? James, the one from Ephesus. And like, you would only have that conversation a couple times before you would stop using the Lord's brother to mean just a Christian, because it wouldn't help, right? Like, that's just how languages work.
And especially when you're writing in a text where you mention multiple Jameses. If you were writing a letter to a community who might not even really be in the know, and you're just writing James the Christian in chapter 1, and then you're talking about the apostle James in chapter 2, those could just as well to them be the exact same person.
Right, because an apostle would be a Christian.
This has to be some kind of a clear identifier that differentiates James from the other James, if the mythicists are correct and these are two different people.
Sure. Yeah. And if we look at the rest of Paul's writings that we can consider authentic Paul writings, does he ever use this Lord's brother or brother of the Lord for any other person other than James? We mentioned the one in 1 Corinthians, but he doesn't refer to Cephas as that. He doesn't refer to anybody else with that, who obviously would be brothers of the Lord if this was a brotherhood, fraternal sort of use of it.
No, he does not. In fact, I went beyond. I looked not only at his letters, but I went and looked also at the commonly argued to be Deutero-Pauline letters, and I found only 4 relatively close parallels. So we have in Philippians 1:14, he writes, "Brothers in the Lord," ton ἀδελφὸν in Creo. Then in Ephesians 6:21, he refers to a brother and faithful servant in the Lord. Again, very similar. Colossians chapter 1 verse 2 refers to faithful brothers in Christ, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 13 refers to brothers beloved by the Lord. At no point where he could easily use this to refer to Christians generally does he use brother of the Lord or brothers of the Lord. Never does. And the qualifier is always in the Lord or in Christ.
Not of.
Not of. They don't belong to Christ. They are not his fictive kin. They are brothers who are brothers within him, i.e., the relation is between themselves, that fraternity.
Gotcha. They're brothers because they're
within the group.
In Jesus, yeah.
Right. They, as members of the body of Christ, they are brothers with each other. At no point are they brothers of Jesus.
I think the point you just made about the rarity of this phrase actually works against the mythicist argument, because they want to point out to all of these places where Paul says brother, but because he uses this phrase, this word brother, all over the place. So when he uses it differently in two places, that should stand out. That should tell you that there's something different going on.
Exactly. Right? And if you think that that's not the case, then you need a different argument, because if this is a general term meant to describe, baptized Christians, just generally, he should be using it quite a bit, because the vast majority of the people he's talking about and to are not apostles. So he doesn't need to make that clarification like he would maybe in Galatians 1:19. He could just throw brother of the Lord out all the time, and it would make sense, specifically in the context of passages like Philippians 1:14, or in Ephesians 6, or Colossians 1, or 2 Thessalonians 2, or insert passage here. There is one different way to argue this. I'm going to just bring it up briefly. It was argued by Frank Zindler in his book, The Jesus the Jews Never Knew. And he argues that it was a cultic title of a specific rank, which would, I guess, more clarify the rarity of it. But the problem is that it doesn't actually then answer who this James is specifically, because there might still be multiple Jameses within that rank. And then on top of that, his evidence for espousing this is pretty weak. He argues that the Textus Receptus of Josephus's Antiquities, book 20, passage number 200, is inauthentic. This is the passage where he refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. That passage, he argues, is mutilated by Christians, and that it originally read James, the brother of the Lord, and that this was evidence that it was a cultic title. And he argues this based off of the summary of Photius in his Bibliotheca. Photius was a later Christian author, and he wrote summaries of ancient texts. And they're exceptionally helpful because occasionally he quotes from them directly. And then on top of that, he also provides a lot of really good information on texts that are now lost. So, for example, mentioning the works of Justus Tiberius and others like that. The problem is that when you actually look at the passage where he's summarizing Antiquities, book 2200, he's paraphrasing it. He's not actually quoting the passage. So you can't make an argument that this is what it originally read.
Right.
Gotcha.
And on top of that, the way that Christians would often paraphrase passages like this is by referring to the brother of the Lord, because this was the Pauline acceptable way to do that. And by this time, the perpetual virginity had won out, and so the idea that these were cousins or like half brothers had also become victorious in early Christianity. So that he's just quoting Galatians 1:19 here. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. And one other thing I was thinking about in terms of the passage in 1:19 is we already have an identifier for James as an apostle. So it's like Paul's like, I met with Cephas and this other apostle, James, which I'm sure there weren't that many apostles named James, but he felt like he needed to distinguish it and almost say the Lord's brother as sort of like he is, an actual brother. He has this exalted position there. That's speculation, but their idea that you needed to identify him as the Lord's brother in a fraternal sense doesn't even make sense in that context, because we already have that he's identifying him as an apostle.
Yeah. And one other thing sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there you go.
No. I'm going to say something else. So yeah.
Okay. I do want to say actually on that identifier, there is actually some valid debate among scholars on that subject of whether or not James is meant to be identified here as an apostle. And the argument basically goes that the exception clause, eime, in Greek is not referring to the entire previous phrase, but is only referring to heteron. Starts this. So in this case, you read the passage not as I didn't see any apostles except for James. Instead, you read it, I did not see any of the other apostles, but I did see James.
Yeah.
But the thing is, though, that if you accept that actually works even harder against the mythicist point, because presumably the apostles would be a smaller group. So maybe there'd only be one James apostle. And so maybe you wouldn't need to clarify more. But if that's not what it means, if James isn't an apostle, then he's just some Joe Schmo Christian out there somewhere.
It makes it worse. Yeah. And so this is why I argue that clarifying whether or not James is an apostle is fairly irrelevant for my case. Either way, it works for me because tradition held that there were multiple Jameses who were apostles. They, in fact, did identify the brother of Jesus as an apostle in early Christian tradition. However, even if James, the brother, is not an apostle, that just makes the case worse because now there could be a million brothers of the Lord named James.
I've met a bunch of them. So
yeah. I have, my uncle is one, my Uncle James. So this is basically a non-starter for them, and I think is also more just a sidetrack issue that they can get people who think Jesus existed hung up on. Because when we spend all this time arguing whether or not James is an apostle, and if I just concede the point that he's not, my case is even stronger. I think the grammar actually more likely lends itself to the idea that he is, specifically because heteron is an adjective. It can't stand alone. It has to come with the rest of that phrase as a compound, because otherwise it doesn't mean anything very helpful. There are some exceptions to this in classical literature, but they actually don't fit the same context as how it's used here. So if you read Richard Longenecker's commentary on Galatians, for example, he goes into why it probably doesn't work and actually notes that there were far easier ways for Paul to write the kind of exceptional clause that the mythicists want out of it.
And I think that point right there is critical because, like, if you imagine, if you take the mythicist argument at face value and say, okay, this is what Paul intended to communicate, and then look at what Paul wrote. He didn't do a good job communicating what they want him to be communicating. Now, sometimes people just do a poor job communicating, so that can happen, right? Yeah. But Paul's a highly educated writer who is pretty good at writing. And so maybe he just did a poor job here, but that's yet another thing you have to accept in order for the mythicist to be correct.
Yes, you have to make several exceptions about him being a very poor communicator. And this is going to also double up in 1 Corinthians 9:5, because Carrier wants to argue that this is not a list of like ascending rank or order, and that these are not all apostles, but the entire context is only discussing apostles. He's talking about the exceptions that the apostles have. He says the other apostles, he mentions the brothers of the Lord, and then he mentions Cephas. And the problem is that on both sides, brothers of the Lord is bracketed by apostles. Cephas is clearly identified as an apostle multiple times in the works of Paul's letters, both in the authentic Pauline letters and also inauthentic ones. And so you have to make the case that Paul is just really bad at grouping things together and actually clarifying what he's talking about as well. Because if brothers of the Lord just identifies any general Christian in context, it still may only be identifying apostles here.
And you also run into the same sort of problem from before with identifying people. If you accept brothers of the Lord just means Christians, then he's saying, can I not bring in a believing wife as like the apostles in Cephas and every Christian? Well, that like, if every single Christian can do this, why are we like listing people out? You know,
Right.
Yeah. If all of the baptized Christians who do missionary work can just tag their wife along, why is there even a problem going on in the Corinthian church that this needs clarification to begin with?
Yeah.
Right.
And why are you starting this whole section of your letter talking specifically about apostles and what apostles can and can't do? Like,
yeah, it's a completely superfluous issue. Yeah. And then why would I bracket it by putting apostles on one end and an apostle on the other end if I'm not talking specifically about apostle privileges? And no matter how you read, even if I accept the mythicist reading, where essentially Carrier's arguing that Paul's having to defend himself from accusations of being a, quote, moocher, unquote. Carrier's highly, highly reputable and very scholastic. Even if I accept his reading of this passage, which I don't, and which not a single commentator I know does, it would still, this argument where all of these are apostles would still work. Because Paul's also self-identifying himself as an apostle, and so at that point, there's no problem, because he's very, very consistent in his letters that he has the same authority that the other apostles do. He's very, Galatians is very much about making sure that people know that his authority is just as good as everyone else's. He's gotten revelation from Christ himself, etc., etc. So it still work in a context where he's only discussing apostles in 1 Corinthians 9:5. He doesn't have to be talking about general Christians at all. So Carrier's entire basis from the context for arguing that brothers of the Lord has to refer to general Christians here for Paul's argument to work is nonsense.
And what you just touched on, I think, is important for skeptics to keep in mind is Carrier and the couple other mythicists who publish their books and blogs and whatnot on this topic. They are the outermost fringe of scholarship in this region. Now, what I'm about to say is not an argument from authority, because I'm not saying that because people disagree with Carrier, he's wrong. That's not what I'm saying. But I can't read Greek. Jared can't read Greek. We're just some rando guys on the internet. We're just skeptics. And so if we're trying to figure out who's right, because we can't read it for ourselves, one valuable heuristic is to look at what all of the scholars are saying. And if, just like if you talk to 100 dentists and 99 of them said it's this thing, and one of them says, no, it's this other completely like off the wall thing, maybe that one is right. But, you know, if every single expert on Paul says it's one thing, and the church fathers who are writing about it, who are native in Greek, said it's this other thing, like basically across the board, every single person throughout history has said this. I don't know. That maybe
at some point you have to acknowledge that maybe your linguistics aren't that good. Like that's just where it comes down to. And this is a consistent problem I've seen across the board with mythicist arguments. You also see the same thing with like Romans chapter 1 verse 3. I wrote an entire paper, like 30-page paper on this subject, debunking how bad the mythicist arguments around this are, because it is entirely hinged on just bad linguistics. Yes, genomenos genomai in some alien foreign world on occasion can mean manufacture, and I guess it could be possible. It means that Jesus was manufactured from the sperm of David. It's possible. Anything is possible. Unicorns are at least imaginably possible. But when I look at the way that the word ginomai is used in terms of human procreation or anything similar in ancient Greco-Roman texts, I found the exact same thing without exception. It denotes human descendants from other human beings. It does not denote some sky daddy making people out of sperm that he stored up there for 2,000 years. I have challenged them. Find me one instance where ginomai is used in any other way than that in the Greco-Roman world. Here's the fun one, is that I went through the works of Josephus, found the word ginomai, was writing it down because it logged again another instance where Josephus uses the word ginomai to indicate a human birth. And then in the exact same passage, he uses Paul's supposedly more common word for birth there as well, which proves that they were interchangeable completely. They were completely synonymous.
That's awesome.
When you're at that point where those two terms are completely synonymous, what case do you have to make? Like, your linguistics are just bad, and they are consistently bad. This book is one of the most amateurish things I have ever read, and you should see the reviews of some of the books that I have read.
I think that's something that is sometimes glossed over, is the fragility of a lot of mythicist arguments, because they rely on this entire stack of suppositions, and every single one of them has to be right. If any of them are wrong, the whole thing's dead. If Paul met Jesus' brothers, mythicism's dead. If Josephus was aware of James being a brother, mythicism is dead. And just over and over and over and over again, if they're wrong on any point, the whole thing shatters.
Yeah, like, I mean, I would be less. I'm less concerned about like the extra biblical sources. It's one of the weird places where mythicists and I actually overlap. Is I think all the mentions in Josephus are inauthentic. I think Tacitus isn't that useful and stuff like that. But you are right. Like with the Pauline epistles, if any single one of these is if any one of their interpretations of the Pauline epistles is wrong, it all collapses. Because if Paul met Jesus's brothers, then Romans 1:3 has to mean that he had a physical birth. Galatians 4:4 has to mean that he was born of an actual woman. And it goes on and on from there, because all of these are just going to start coalescing together. If one of it is just a game of Jenga, but where the base is one block.
One block, yeah. It's Jenga, but every single level is just one block.
Yeah, Kipling made that analogy on one of his streams, so I plagiarized from Kip. Hope you
it's not plagiarism if you cite it. So now you're not plagiarizing, now you're citing. So it's okay.
Yeah. So yeah, no, it's just consistently like that. So that's why I also even in my work, I'm working on an essay specifically on the issue of Galatians 1:19. I can grant them virtually every single point that they have offered, and nothing is going to make Galatians 1:19 mean anything other than biological siblings. Because that is the only way that it makes any sense in this passage, regardless of whether or not James is an apostle, regardless of whether or not they were the brothers of the Lord in 1 Corinthians 9:5 are apostles. No matter how you square it, these are denoting physical brothers. And if you want to argue otherwise, you have to make the case that of the 20 some odd authors I have found across the ancient world who all use these exact phrases, Paul is the only exception.
Yeah. That'd be a pretty hard task to do. I think one thing is important here too, is if we just look at this at face value and we look at the text and we say, what does this text mean in its context compared to other writings of Paul and other ancient writers, how would we understand this? We're going to come to the conclusion we came to today.
If we didn't come to it like worried about whether Jesus existed or not.
Correct. If we just did that, Exactly. However, if we have a pre-decided conclusion that Jesus is a myth, and we come to this and we go, well, that doesn't make sense, so I have to come up with another explanation. And that's what I think mythicists are doing. They're not actually doing proper scholarship. They're not doing proper skepticism. They're not applying those heuristics to this text like you would anything else. They're actually doing something that a lot of apologists do in the Christian world. So
it's just a possibility fallacy. It's possible, therefore it must be probable. And that's all it is, because none of the actual work that they have and that they actually cite builds off of this. When you go read, for example, all of this hinges on Carrier's concept that all the brothers all Christians become the brothers of Christ when they are baptized. I'll give you one guess where he finds this in Paul's letters.
I'm going to guess nowhere.
Exactly nowhere. The closest he comes to is in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, where it says that Jesus will be the firstborn of many brothers. And he just takes this little bit out of context and compares it with another passage in Romans 6. But if you actually look at that one verse in context, it's not talking about that at all. It's not saying that these are actual brothers of Jesus, or that these are fraternal brothers of Jesus in Romans 8. Instead, what it's actually talking about is that he is the first one resurrected, and through him the brothers are resurrected. He is the firstborn of the resurrection of many brothers. The brothers are not his. The brothers are us, the believers, the followers of Jesus. So I went to try and see if Carrier had any case to be made on this. So I went and I looked at like 17 different commentaries, 3 in German, because I was having trouble finding much, and none of them agree with him on this. They all, like in one of the most influential commentaries, for example, from Douglas Moo, you go and read it, and he's like, no, this is not what this means. This is specifically indicating that these are the brothers in the resurrection. These are brothers in Christ, just all over again. And that is borne out by the way that Paul uses that terminology. When you go and look, does he ever say brothers of the Lord as a general demarcator of Christians? No. Nowhere. He only ever uses brothers in the Lord, or brothers in Christ, or brothers beloved by the Lord. If we were his brothers, where is this?
So, real quick recap of everything that we covered. The mythicists argue that this usage of the word brothers of the Lord refers to fictive kinship. It's kind of a generic term, but this doesn't match how any other Greco-Roman author uses this phrase. Every single time any author uses it, they mean an actual brother, like a blood brother. It doesn't match how the church fathers use it in early Christianity, who had a vested interest in it not meaning brother or not meaning a blood relative. They, who were native Greek speakers, they also understood it had to have a biological component. It wouldn't make sense because it wouldn't be a meaningful demarcation of this James to be like just a generic Christian that wouldn't actually communicate any useful information. And it doesn't match. It's unique. Paul would be a unique instance of this kind of phrasing meaning the kind of thing they need it to mean. And so while it is possible that it means that, because anything's possible, it's not probable.
Yeah.
So,
and this is all true, regardless of how we take the historicity of like the Gospels or any of the later traditions as well. I don't need to know the names of all of his brothers to know that's what Paul's talking about.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge. I've definitely learned, even though I've read a bunch on this and listened to a bunch on this, I've learned new stuff today, so I hope it was useful for the audience too. We're going to put links in the description, the link you provided me to some of your research and all the awesome stuff you presented here, so people can go and find your excellent work elsewhere. For us, if you want to see more stuff like this, make sure you subscribe, hit the bell so you'll see it coming up in the future. I believe next week, maybe sometime in the future. If you're a Patreon, you'll see it. If you're on Patreon, you'll see it sooner. We're going to be talking about our the Stratoturn and our carbon dating series. We're going to be talking about some contamination and alternative explanations for the carbon dating. So make sure you subscribe to see that. But until next time, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.
Peace out.